Hi, I'm Robin Thompson, and I am a nonprofit consultant. I am based here in beautiful Vail, Colorado, where the sky's always blue and the snow's always on the rooftops. And we're here today to talk about starting a 501c3 nonprofit organization, to be or not to be a nonprofit. And when we get finished with this today, it should give you some good ideas as to whether you want to start a nonprofit or not. Well, I was in the corporate world. I was a professional speaker and trainer for many years, working with Fortune 500 companies. My husband got a job in small town, Southern Oregon. And right after we moved there, we lost air service. And when I realized I was going to have to drive 70 miles on a 2-lane road to a commuter airport, I realized that my speaking business of being on the road all the time was not sustainable. There just happened to be a job open at the university, which was one of the 7 public universities in Oregon, as director of alumni relations. And I thought, I think I can do that job. An interim administration hired me. And so within the first 2 months of me working there, the development fundraising staff went from 11 people to 2.3. And I was one of the 2.3 that was left. So we get a new president. And he pointed to me and he said, Robin, you are executive director of the nonprofit foundation and you're vice president of development, and you have 6 months to raise $2.4 million. And as a side note, they hadn't raised that much in the previous 3 years combined. But he said, if we do, then we get a $1 million challenge grant. Well, I didn't know what I didn't know. So I hired somebody to take over my alumni duties. And then I hired a nonprofit consultant. And I said, just teach me everything you know. Well, as another side note here, we had very upset donors and a very upset board because they had started building this new Center for Health Professionals. And the president of the university didn't trust the development office. So she had kept all of the fundraising in the president's office. Well, while the project was going on, she died of breast cancer. So when she died, literally all of her connections and contacts died too. So add to that, there was this great volunteer fundraising team, and they went out and raised the $21 million for the building. And when they came back, the administration said, no, really it's a $28 million project. Well, they grumbled a little bit, but the volunteers went back out, they raised the $28 million, and they came back, and administration said, you know what? It's really a $32 million project. And by that time, the volunteers are like done, finished. The donors are upset because they said, why do the costs keep escalating? And so we are trying to raise money for a building that's already been moved in to get that $1 million challenge grant. Well, so we're raising money, little amounts. I mean, we were lucky to get a $2,500 donation. We might get a $500 donation here and there. And a few months into it, the consultant said, I'm going to write them a letter and tell them we're not going to make it. And I said, you can write the letter, but please don't send it. I said, they told us because of the extenuating circumstances that they would give us an extension, but not to ask for another. And I said, I still want to try. I want to see if we can do this. Well, we get about halfway in and we hit the $1 million mark. We had raised $1 million. And I said, I think we can do this. My consultant said, Robin, it's impossible. So we get to 1 week before, and $550,000 we still needed to get to our 2.4 million. Well, I picked up the telephone and I called everybody I knew, and the day that it's due, by then I'd hired staff. I had about 10 people working for me, and I hired the staff, and we all came into the conference room, and people were so downtrodden and said, Robin, we thought we could make it. Some people even had tears. And I brought out the champagne and I brought out the orange juice, and I said, we did it. We had an anonymous donor come in at the last minute, and he covered the last $550,000. At that point, I was hooked on the nonprofit world because, see, here's what I learned. You have people over here that have money that they want to give to a good cause. You have people or people and nonprofits over here who really need the money because of the people they're serving. And so when you put those two entities together, it's like putting puzzle pieces in a puzzle. It feels so good. And so at that point, I was hooked. Well, since then, after working for the university, I've worked for several other nonprofits of large and small size. I've worked for a K-12 independent private school. I have done consulting with all sizes of nonprofits, and I have started, I think now in the last few years, I've helped start about 5 new nonprofits. So when I was asked by the SBDC if I would be willing to do a program on, what do we need to do to get started, I said, let's back up a little bit. Let's talk about what is it that would tell us that we should start a nonprofit, or should we do a for-profit? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my slides, and we're going to talk about the kinds of groups that can and can't form a nonprofit. We're going to talk about the benefits and advantages of a 501c3 nonprofit. We're going to talk about next steps for setting up the nonprofit and how to obtain funding to get started with your nonprofit. Well, to start out with, let's talk about, what is a nonprofit organization? One of the biggest misnomers that I see is that people think that when you have a nonprofit, you have to spend all your money every year. But think about this scenario. You have a ski-related type of nonprofit. So let's say they provide services to people with disabilities or kids. They teach them to ski. They give them scholarships. And so if you're on a calendar year and your nonprofit ends at the end of December, but ski season still lasts through April, if you had to spend all your money by the end of the year, then you'd have no money to continue on into the next year. So a nonprofit organization does not mean you need to spend all of your money. So let me read you what the definition of a nonprofit is. It's a business established to further a social cause or provide a public benefit. There are many types of nonprofit organizations, with the most common being a 501c3. They are tax exempt, which means that not only are they not required to pay certain federal and state income taxes, and we'll talk about that later, but they can also receive tax-deductible donations from supporters. So a for-profit organization is one that it's obvious. It's the business down the street. It's for-profit. A nonprofit has a lot of different characteristics, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. So there's a social cause, or it provides a public benefit. And so when we talk about what a social cause is, the IRS has specific designations for what a social cause would be. It's things like that we would think about helping thy brother's keeper type of organizations. Now, it doesn't have to just be helping people. Think about environmental organizations. Environmental organizations help people, but they preserve land to help people. Alpine gardens, zoos. So all of those have a piece of the people in them, but they provide a social cause so that people are involved and it has a public benefit. So a 501c3. So most of the nonprofits that you would start would be a public 501c3, a public organization. So the difference is a private is more like a 509A, and that would be like a family foundation. So let's say your family has some wealth and they would put it in a trust, a family trust or a family foundation. That's different, and they have different rules for that than they do for a 501c3 nonprofit. Now, there's a lot of different 501cs. There are 501c6s, 501c9s. For instance, a Chamber of Commerce might be a 501c, either it's a 6 or a 9. And with a chamber, they can't raise money, but they are a nonprofit organization. So I'm thinking that most of you all will be starting a 501c3, and we'll talk just a little bit more about that. And we talked about being exempt from some federal and state income taxes, and that they can receive taxable donations. Okay, so what kinds of groups can form a 501c3? So first off, it has to be a charitable organization. And so we'll talk a little bit more about how one person can't benefit. It has to be a group of people, a charitable group, a social group that benefits. So it has to be charitable and not selling a product. It can be educational. I told you I worked for an independent K through 12 school. Colleges, a lot of times, will have a nonprofit foundation that's a part of a nonprofit that's part of them, and it could be educational related foundation or whatever. And then there are educational nonprofits that serve the nonprofit industry. I mean, it could be something like a literacy or something along those lines. Religious. So churches have a separate designation, but a school could be a Christian school, a Catholic school. So the religious, and then there are religious organizations. My brother-in-law has an organization that helps men learn about Christ and learn about Christian values. And so religious related. Scientific, we know we're talking about research. There's one in Nevada called Desert Research Institute, and all they do is scientific research, and so they are a nonprofit. Literacy, we talked a little bit about that. So a lot of libraries have a literacy nonprofit that teaches, whether it teaches English as a second language, it teaches kids, adults that have English as a second language, it teaches them. Testing for public safety. Now, that could be a lot of different organizations as to whether they test things for cars. I mean, it could be any number of things. To foster youth or amateur sports competitions. So, something like the X Games or some other type of competition. A lot of times, like a soccer is more of a club than a nonprofit. There are ways that those organizations can be a nonprofit, but it would need to foster youth or sports competition for more than one particular entity. So preventing cruelty to children or animals. So those are the types of groups that can form nonprofits. All right, so let's get a little workout here. What I want you to do is, and if you have somebody standing around, they're going to wonder what you're doing, but you just play along here. Okay, I want you to lift your left thumb up like this. And then I want you to point your right finger like you see on the screen right now. I don't want, like Tom Hanks, I don't want your thumb up. I want your thumb down. And over here, I don't want the fist like the little boy you see. I just want the finger up. Okay, so your left hand has a finger up. Your right hand has the index finger pointed. So now what I want you to do is I want you to switch sides. So I want you to finger left, thumb up right. Your index finger's pointed, your thumb up right. Okay, now that you've got that, we'll go back the other direction. So now your thumb up left, your finger pointing right. Okay, let's do it again. Finger pointing left, thumb up right. Okay, again, faster. Thumb up left, finger pointing right. Finger pointing left, thumb up right. Okay, good job. All right, so why did I have you do that? One of the reasons is because it was uncomfortable the first time you did it and you really had to think hard. That's what it's going to be starting a nonprofit, especially if you haven't worked in a nonprofit or volunteered for a nonprofit and you're not familiar with a lot of the way things that are done in a nonprofit, and you've worked in a for-profit or government or some other type of entity. So you saw how uncomfortable that felt in the beginning, right? But then once you started doing it, it got a little easier, didn't it? That's what'll happen. Once you start working through this, the paperwork, there is a lot of it to start a nonprofit, but just like with the fingers, it will start getting easier. So now you didn't know you were going to get a calisthenic workout with your fingers today, did you? Okay, so let's talk about the difference in the for-profit and a nonprofit. So when we talk about a for-profit, it's what you're used to. You know, that's when they deliver products or services. And you as a for-profit, you generate a profit. I mean, that's why you're in business. And then there's a ownership structure. So for instance, usually one person or maybe, you know, a couple or three people own an organization. You might be the owner, it might be somebody else. Where a nonprofit, the mission benefits society. Now, a for-profit can benefit society too, but a nonprofit, the total mission is to benefit society. There's no single owner, and sometimes that's really difficult for people who are used to working in an organization where they're the ones that are the boss, the buck stops here kind of person. Because in a nonprofit, the board, especially the board chair and the rest of the board, are who that the nonprofit answers to, because the board has fiduciary responsibility for this organization. And so they have a say-so. So the person that's the founder, executive director, etc., for them to go out and do something without the approval of the board is a big no-no. So it's a group approval. So knowing that you're okay with that. And then the nonprofit assets aren't distributed to individuals. So in a for-profit, you know, if the organization makes good money, then people get part of the profits. But that is not the case in a nonprofit. It's distributed to the people and the causes that the mission of the organization is. So basically, for-profits in business to make a profit. The nonprofit, it has a social purpose, and the income goes to that purpose. Okay, let's test your knowledge. Which of these organizations can submit to be a 501c3 nonprofit organization? All right, let's talk about the first one. They provide food to people who are food insecure. Can they be a nonprofit? Yes or no? If you said yes, they can be. How about if they give money to people who need financial help? This is a tricky one. Can they give money to people who need financial help? Well, that depends. You can't form a nonprofit and then just go hand your neighbor money. You need to have a process. For instance, let's say it's a nonprofit who gives scholarships to kids who are going to college. They have a process where the students have to go through that process, and then it is an anonymous looking at those applications and deciding the children that get those scholarships. So yes, you can give money who need financial help, but it can't just be randomly giving out money. You can do that, but not on a regular basis. That cannot be your mission. How about a homeless shelter? Can a homeless shelter Yeah, homeless shelter can be a nonprofit. How about giving scholarships for skiing or outdoor sports? Yeah. For instance, there's one called SOS Outreach in the Vail Valley, where they give scholarships to students to learn how to ski, and they have mentors, as well as Access Unbound is a nonprofit who gives scholarships to people who have disabilities who cannot afford to take lessons or get the equipment needed to do skiing. How about private schools, kindergarten through 12th grade? Yeah, I mean, a public school would most likely not be a 501c3, but an independent private school, a Christian school, a Jewish school, a Catholic school, just a plain old private Montessori school. Okay, how about selling shoes and giving a pair to someone who needs them? Is that a for-profit or a nonprofit? It's kind of a tricky one, isn't it? Because you're probably thinking of Tom's shoes. And the way that started was that Tom was in, I'm not sure, it was Brazil, South America or something. And he saw all these kids without shoes, and he said, I want to find a way to help those kids have shoes. So Tom's Shoes was born, and every time that you buy a pair of Tom's shoes, another pair is given to a child that needs it. So is Tom's a for-profit business or a nonprofit? Tom's is a for-profit business. They may have a nonprofit arm now, so you'll see businesses do that sometimes they will start a nonprofit arm. For instance, sometimes people come to me and say that they want to help people, so they want to start a nonprofit, and really their business idea can easily be a for-profit business, and it's much easier to start a for-profit business. There's less paperwork, it takes less time. You can get a for-profit business, just establish a business license, and you have a for-profit business. Where a nonprofit, you have to go through some hoops to get to that point where that you do have your nonprofit established. So what I just advised this one organization that what they wanted to do was definitely a for-profit business, but they wanted to be able to help people get medical care that can't afford it. I said, start the for-profit business and then come back after you get the for-profit business established and start the nonprofit that then can give scholarships to people who can't afford the medical that they need. Okay, how about giving money to family members to travel to other countries for internships? That's a tough one too, because your sense wants to say, no, it's not, but then you see that word internship. So they're not getting paid, but you can't give money to family members to travel to other countries. And I'll tell you what happened that back in the 60s, there were some wealthy individuals that found that there was just this little loophole in the law, and that they could form a family foundation. So that's the private foundation I was talking about, and give their kids money to go travel around Europe for a year. Well, the IRS caught wind of that. And so what they put into place was something called self-dealing. And self-dealing means that when you put money into a family foundation, you get the tax break at that point. And so here they were using tax-free money to give to their kids to go travel around Europe. So the IRS said, anyone in your family, it's considered self-dealing if the family foundation that was established and now has tax-free money in it, that foundation cannot give money to any family members. And it's not just kids, grandkids, but it goes all the way down to nieces and nephews, anybody connected to that nonprofit. So no, you can't give money, family members money to travel to other countries for an internship and have that be your nonprofit. Okay, so number 8, how about help for businesses that need money and advice? Well, that one is kind of tricky too, because government has just been giving money to businesses that need money and advice. So here's a rule of thumb. As long as it's not your own business that it's giving money to. So let me explain how that works. So let's say that a therapy, a type of physical therapy. So there's a physical therapy business, but there's all these kids in the schools that need physical therapy, but they can't do it because they can't afford to go to the physical therapy business. So the physical therapy business then starts a nonprofit to be able to give scholarships to people who need them. But be very careful here. There's something called inurement, INUREMENT. So it forbids the income or assets of a tax-exempt organization to directly or indirectly benefit the owners of the business. So with the physical therapy business, they've got the physical therapy business over here, and then the nonprofit is raising money so that these kids can get the physical therapy. So if that nonprofit gives money directly to the for-profit and the owners of that for-profit benefit, because that's also the nonprofit who started the nonprofit and they're part of the nonprofit, then that's called inurement. So be very careful if that's what you're going to do. Okay, how about a camp for children? Yeah, there are nonprofit camps. For instance, there are the Paul Newman camps that are across the country that are all nonprofits. Marketing a product that says be generous or be kind. No, that's not a nonprofit, although there are nonprofits that can be formed as a part of that business. Again, just to be very careful that we don't create inurement. How about purchasing land for a conservation easement for environmental purposes? Now, with the conservation easement, you don't own the land. Yeah, that's a nonprofit. They're typically called land trusts. And I have worked with land trusts. Actually, a few years ago, we had just over 6 weeks to raise $550,000 to be able to purchase a conservation easement. Now, interestingly, people said, oh, there's no way. People aren't going to give money for something that you're not really purchasing. But remember what I said about a nonprofit and how it's different than a for-profit. So people get in this business mindset and they think that people aren't going to give money if they don't get something for it. But what they give is a conservation easement. That means that property is protected into perpetuity. Okay, so there are the 11 different questions about testing your knowledge, and I bet you did pretty well on those. Okay, so let's talk about the benefits and the disadvantages of having a nonprofit. Well, so benefits, of course, tax exempt. And remember we said from the majority of federal and state taxes, and then people get a deduction when they give money to your nonprofit. If they're eligible for public and private grants. And so if you want to write a grant for something, you might write a government grant, or you might know a granting foundation who is going to give money, and you can write a grant for that. There's a formal structure. And so if you work well in that type of environment, because you've got the board bylaws, you have how each board meeting goes, you have notes that are kept, and so there is a formal structure, and there is a limited liability. I do suggest that board members have a lot, the nonprofit has liability insurance for the board members, because they do have fiduciary responsibility for the board. So what are the disadvantages? First one's cost. And we will talk about cost in one of the subsequent ones of these. So if you're going through the whole series, you'll learn more about the cost, but it can be a disadvantage, especially if you're comparing it to a for-profit business. There's a lot of paperwork. The 1023, which is the form that you will fill out to submit for your nonprofit status with the government, it is very long and it is very involved, and there's a lot of paperwork you have to keep along the way, like board minutes, etc. And again, we've already talked about the shared control because you're not in charge. And then there's scrutiny by the public. Now, you may not think that's the case. There can be with for-profit business, but really with nonprofits, because people said, I gave you my money because I wanted you to do X with it. I had one nonprofit where somebody came up to me and said they wanted to do an estate gift or a planned gift, and they wanted it for this organization to replace their sound system. And then he went on to say, but I do not want you to use a penny of that for any salaries. And about then his wife walks up and she said, we aren't paying the light bill. We're not paying the gas bill. They were so specific about how they wanted their money used. And we as a nonprofit, that's called restricted funds, and we need to spend it. If we take their money, we need to spend it the way they want it spent. But if he doesn't like the sound system that's put in there, he very possibly can come back and say something. Somebody else said, oh, that's a bad sound system, whatever. Then you have that public scrutiny. Recently, probably maybe 3 or 4 years ago, the Red Cross, they found that they hadn't used some of their funds the way that they were intended. And so there is public scrutiny where you might not get that as much with a private business. Okay, I would like for you to just sit there and think about this. Would you rather burn calories, or would you rather watch a good movie? Burn calories or watch a good movie? Okay, a lot of times I am really surprised at people wanting to burn calories instead of watching a good movie. What if I told you you could do both? Our brain burns about 800 calories a day. And after that, our brain literally stops listening. So what rests our brain is story. Can you say binge watching? That we just get so overloaded that we sit in front of the television and we binge watch. That's why movies rest our brain, because 30% of our day is spent daydreaming. So that's what I want you to think about. I want you to think about your story for starting a nonprofit. And I want you to assess yourself, and then we'll talk more about that story. Why do you want to start a nonprofit? So most likely you're starting it to make a difference. To make a difference how? And we'll answer some of those questions here in just a minute. What does an evaluation indicate? So if you're ready to start a for-profit business, a lot of times you're like, oh, I've got this great Shark Tank idea, and I'm not going to tell anybody, right? Because if I tell somebody, they might steal it. Well, it's different with a nonprofit. Yes, somebody can still steal your idea, but it's different because you're serving societal good, and you want to ask people, what do you think about this idea? Do you think this needs help? Should I pursue this? Is this something that, and you've probably said, somebody just needs to do something about this, right? And if a nonprofit fills that need, as opposed to a for-profit, then doing an evaluation. And what that evaluation looks like is you asking people what they think. And it can be an informal evaluation, but a lot of times people don't want to get people's opinions about it because they're afraid people will shoot it down. So find people who you know will tell you the truth, but because you don't want to go down this road, if it's something that's not needed or people say, oh, everybody else is doing the same thing. How do you feel about fundraising? Many people that just makes their hair curl when they have to think about fundraising. So how do you feel about it? Could your organization be a for-profit and not a nonprofit? So really list out both sides. What are the advantages to a for-profit? What are the advantages to a nonprofit? What style works best for you in a business environment? Again, a nonprofit typically has fewer staff. So like I explained in the beginning, I did everything for the nonprofit. I learned how to do the database. I learned how to do the finances. We had an accountant still. I learned how to manage the board. I had to learn to do everything. In the beginning, you're probably going to need to do everything. Is that a business environment that works for you? Do you have people you can surround yourself with that will help you be able to succeed in that environment? And then how will you know if your nonprofit is successful? So we're going to answer some questions here in just a minute to help you see what is it that my nonprofit will do and how will we move forward. So your nonprofit's mission. My nonprofit represents the people who, and so if you need to stop the recording and write down, who are you going to represent? Even if you're an environmental organization, even if you are a land trust, river organization, you're going to represent people who value the environment, people who want to have clean water, right? What are you going to do better than any other organization? Because see, what this is going to help you do is decide what is our unique factor going to be? What are we going to do better than any other organization? Because I'll tell you what, there are over 1.8 million nonprofits out there in the country, and most of them have budgets under $250,000. And because of that, we don't need any more nonprofits. And so when somebody comes to me and says, I want to start a nonprofit, when I go through these questions with them, we see, would it fit better under a nonprofit that's already established as a program? Or is this so unique that you're going to be able to do something better than any other organization does it? So how will we see the results? The results will be easily seen by what? What will change? What is no one else able to do as well as you can when you start this nonprofit? And then where's the impact? What is the impact of the work that you're going to do? So all of that's going to come together into your story. And this story here is one that was written in a case statement. And so we'll talk a little bit later in one of the other series about what a case statement is. It's basically the case for support for your nonprofit. So let me just read you this story. Vincent said, it was not easy growing up in my family. When I was little, I had a drug-addicted, alcoholic, and abusive father. I spent 7 years in foster care. I moved around a lot and experienced pain and fear. Can you imagine 7 birthdays waking up to the insecurity of not knowing whether you would stay with this foster family or be moved somewhere else? Having no one to share this most important day of your life left you wondering if your birth parents even knew what day it was. Then Vincent said, after all the turmoil that he had endured, my first day of SOS was the happiest and most fun day of my life. So what I ask nonprofits, new nonprofits, to think about is, how are you going to change someone's life? So what is it that will make a difference? Just like with Vincent, it made a difference in his life. Okay, so here are the 7 questions to consider before you start a nonprofit. Will you serve a charitable class? So I said I was going to give you a definition for what a charitable class is from the IRS. It's a group of individuals that may properly receive assistance from a charitable organization. A charitable class is a group of people or other defined groups such as endangered animals or wildlife habitat, etc., who can properly receive assistance or programming from charitable organizations. An organization created and operated solely for the benefit of one person or one specific disaster event would generally not qualify. However, an organization created and operated to benefit all victims of a particular disaster type would qualify. So, do you have a charitable program? It's the who, what, when, where, and how. Okay, what's your program? Many times a nonprofit wants to start and say, oh yeah, well, we just need to help kids. What's your program? Like, how are you going to help kids? And that's something that you will have to describe in your 1023 paperwork that you submit to the IRS. And then if you conducted that evaluation or assessment we talked about, just to see if people believe this is something that's needed, if there's other nonprofits that are doing it, if there are for-profit businesses that are doing it. Can you fund the startup of the organization? I was just talking to somebody the other day, and she's using her 401k and her retirement to fund the nonprofit. And I'm like, that pains me. I don't want to see anybody using their retirement. Find some donors, and we'll talk about that in one of the later ones of this series too, about how to get money. Do you have an anticipated budget? That's something they will ask for in the 1023 form that you'll fill out for the IRS. The anticipated budget, like how much is it going to cost this organization to run? And then we'll know how much money we need to raise. Have you written your bylaws? Your bylaws are what the board will live by, what you will live by. And that's important when you're looking at getting board members. So what do those bylaws look like? And then do you have a board who's connected? So finding those board members, because you'll have to list them on your 501c3 paperwork. Okay, so here's common mistakes that I see. So the first one is lack of planning. So many times people just want to get started. They say, let me just start. I know what we need to do here. Let's just start. So if you're forming a business, you do a business plan. Many new nonprofits will do a business plan for the nonprofit, because that startup organization, that will help board members get excited about what you're doing, and that then they know that you have a plan that you're working on. And it also evaluates that competitive environment. Now, I told you, that nonprofits aren't competitive like a for-profit business, but still there's a competition for donor dollars out there. Okay, limited nonprofit financial knowledge. Many times I see accountants say, oh yeah, we can do nonprofits. Oh yeah, it's not that much different. I've had some really bad experiences with accountants who have said that. So if you have limited nonprofit financial knowledge, even if you have for-profit financial knowledge, if you have limited nonprofit financial knowledge, find someone who does. And set realistic expectations of what you think you can do with your nonprofit. Not conducting an evaluation or assessment, we've talked about that. Not building an effective board. I have something I do with board members where it's called a board decision book. It's about 22 pages long. It describes what their job is as a volunteer board member. It also gives them ideas of things that the board can do, and lets them choose which one of those things that they would like to do. We'll talk more about that later. And then not developing relationships. Those relationships are so key to people helping you, whether they volunteer to help your nonprofit, whether they give money for your nonprofit, whether they want to be on your board. Getting a team of people around you, developing those relationships. All right, so what are the next steps for setting up your nonprofit? Well, you need to decide on a name. What's your nonprofit going to be called? And what we'll do next time is we will talk about how you have to submit that name with the Secretary of State and be sure that no other nonprofit or for-profit has that name. You want to establish your core values. And so the questions that we were talking about earlier, those are important things for you to answer, and those will help you establish your core values. Writing your specific objectives and purposes, all that will be part of your bylaws. You know, what are your programs going to be? What's that going to look like? How are you going to deliver those programs? Then how to obtain funding to get started. We've got a whole section that we will do on that. But first off, your evaluation or your assessment. Even established nonprofits, some of them, I see them skipping this step. If they're doing a capital campaign, if they are doing some kind of a endowment campaign, or they skip this step, and it's so crucial. Here's what you're going to do. You're going to ask people for advice. You're going to say, I'm thinking about doing this. Can I have some advice from you? And the more that you tell the person and you share your passion with them from those questions we talked about, they're going to say, how can I help? I mean, is there anything I can do? If there's anything I can do, just let me know, right? And so now you're going to put those people's names over here, and you're going to keep putting those people's names over here. And that's going to be your assessment. Those are those relationships you're going to develop. And that's probably going to be your initial funding that you're going to get started. I had one nonprofit who somebody was so excited about what they were doing, they just gave them $30,000 and said, I don't want to be on the board. I just want to give you money because this is such a worthy cause. So because the paperwork is sometimes overwhelming, why even do it? Because it's incredibly fulfilling. See, you have a passion for something that you really believe in, that you think needs to birth and become life. And because you do, that's why it's incredibly fulfilling, and that's what will keep you going. Well, I appreciate you being here today, and if you have any questions, you are welcome to get in touch with me. You can get in touch with me through the Northwest SBDC. That's a copy of my book that's available at Amazon now, and there's my email and phone number if you have specific questions for me. So thanks so much for being here.